This is essentially a talk about censorship in comics. Although it has a marvellously poncy title, they're contested images of the future in a visual medium. I was going to change it to something a little bit more normal, but I thought I'd leave it, as it's a kind of over-wordy title you get in academia. And it's quite amusing. Just to start it off with, the logo on the left of the slide is for Entertaining Comics, or a big comic company in the 1950s. Some people listening might have heard of them. And you've got Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 there. And you've got a rather famous book, Seduction of the Innocent. Now, some people who are familiar with the history of comics and popular fiction are probably familiar with that book. But I was going to talk about how that sort of censorship interconnects with the whole Cold War period and McCarthyism as we go on. Here's Senator Joseph McCarthy. I think most people have a working grasp of American history, are familiar with him and the whole Reds Under the Bed scandal and period. I'll read out the slide. If the 1950s in the US might be described as an early part of the atomic age, it was also the age of McCarthyism. McCarthyism has been described in various ways since the 1950s, and its political outlook, the suspicion of communism associated with it, still has some political currency. I'd say quite a lot of political currency since I last did this talk. The phrase Reds under the bed has come to be associated with the era and the political climate extant in the US at that time. If you look on the right of the slide, you'll see an anti-communist propaganda leaflet. And if you look on the sort of concerns on it, fluoridated water, polio serum, or polo monkey serum as it calls it, and mental hygiene, well, it doesn't look too far away from some of the conspiracy theory stuff that people go on about today. The whole leering skull, the sort of the public being represented by the scared little girl and the mummy being looking vulnerable and being attacked. And McCarthy was quite eager to play on this sort of stuff. But McCarthy also arose at a time when popular fiction was dominated to some extent by, well, the last vestiges of pulp fiction, which was slowly being replaced by another popular medium, that of the comic book. Before we go on, it's probably a good idea to read out a bit of a speech by McCarthy. Now, there's probably some people listening who'd agree with this speech, and there's probably some people who disagree strongly with it, and there's some people who sit somewhere in the middle. But I read it out so you can get an idea of his rhetorical style. The real basic difference, however, lies in the religion of immoralism, invented by Marx, preached feverishly by Lenin, and carried to unimaginable extremes by Stalin. This religion of immoralism, if the red half of the world triumphs, and well it may, gentlemen, this religion of immoralism will more deeply wound and damage mankind than any conceivable economic or political system. You notice how he repeats immoralism there again and again and again to hammer his point in. Karl Marx dismissed God as a hoax, and Lenin and Stalin have added in clear-cut, unmistakable language their resolve that no nation, no people who believe in a God can exist side by side with their communistic state. Karl Marx, for example, expelled people for his Communist Party for mentioning such things as love, justice, humanity, and morality. He called this soulful ravings and sloppy sentimentality. Now, of course, you'd want to investigate that if you were wise to find the context, but McCarthy knew that wasn't likely to happen, I think. Today we're engaged in a final all-out battle between communistic atheism and Christianity. The modern champions of communism have selected this as the time, and ladies and gentlemen, the chips are down, they are truly down. That lovely little rhetorical flourish at the end, the chips are down, they are truly down, repeated to hammer it home. And this is Dr. Frederick Werther looking, well, the comic book says shock on the cover, and he certainly looks shocked. Now, I'll read out the slide, because Frederick Werther isn't someone you naturally think of as an ally of McCarthy if you're aware of more about his background. Normally, all people talk about Wertham nowadays is the one book he wrote, Seduction of the Innocent, but he actually isn't that someone you'd actually cite at first as an ally, McCarthy, if you know about him. At first sight, Frederick Wortham would seem to be a natural opponent of McCarthyism rather than an ally. However, the period after World War II in the US saw a steadily increasing level of concern about the possible corruption of public morals. This was not unprecedented, and the Hays Code regarding movies was introduced in the 1930s, due to a similar public debate about the lack of censorship in motion pictures. For those not familiar with the Hays Code, it was introduced due to what was considered as shocking usage of women with revealing clothing and shocking things such as interracial marriage and stuff like that. It led to quite silly stuff such as you not being able to show a couple in bed together and absolutely silly stuff like that. And Frederick Wortham is usually remembered, as I say, for one thing only when his name is quoted, and that is the suppression of popular literature in the form of comics and magazines. But there's a lot more to his life than that. His accomplishments as a doctor providing free care to black patients and those who could not afford to pay should be actually mentioned to balance the whole debate about censorship that book's Seduction of the Innocent gave rise to. That was a study of where he contended that comics were one of the leading causes of juvenile delinquency in the US. And we'll move on and have a look at some of the comics of the era and see why he thought so. Just before we do, though, there's a copy of the first edition of Seduction of the Innocent with someone like a kid looking like they're looking through a rather strangely shaped letterbox, and a Collier's Wood magazine article. Collier's Wood was a very, very well-known magazine that published lots of popular articles and horror in the nursery, where it goes on about the horror of horror comics, to coin a phrase, and stresses how they were corrupting kids, a bit like the video nasties of the late 40s or 50s. This sort of folk demon stuff tends to be repeated again and again and again. And even I'm going to say, you might see where he might have had some concerns. EC Comics was rather famous for publishing crime and horror comics, and that particular title over there on the left, Crime and Suspense Stories, that issue there became the subject of a congressional hearing, and the exchange is worth reading out. Senator Kavofel, here is your May issue. There seems to be a man with a bloody axe holding a woman's head up, which has been severed from her body. Do you think that's in good taste? And here's the publisher. Yes, sir, I do, for the cover of a homo comic. A cover in bad taste, for example, might be defined as holding her head a little higher so the blood can be seen dripping from it, and moving the body further over so the neck of the body could be seen. Cavalry, doubtful, you've got blood coming out. Well, much as I think the art is lovely and wonderful, and I have a penchant for black humour and horror literature, I could see how a parent might, in the early 50s or mid-50s, be a bit concerned about little Tommy picking that up. And there is a room for a debate on both sides of this, and I could see how people might see this as an influence of both law and morals, and, as some people try to put forward, foreign influence. It certainly did lead to a huge outcry. Now, you might wonder what Ray Bradbury has to do with all this. Ray Bradbury enters the story because Fantagraphics, here who's reprinted EC's adaptations of his works, was adapted numerous times by EC by top-line artists. And of course, Ray Bradbury is famous for being opposed to censorship. And much of Bradbury's Martial Chronicles and other stories, some of his stories that are not strictly science fiction and stray more into fantasy or almost horror, are also adapted. That's reproduction is rather huge, I should point out. In real life, it's about 3 foot tall and weighs about 5 or 6 pounds. But of course, the whole farcical senatorial hearings killed EC Comics, because the public viewed it as a comic company that was compromised, producing just horror material, and was probably influenced by the Reds through the back door. And unfortunately, it led to the Comics Code, which led to years and years of anodyne comics where you couldn't mention words like zombie or horror or vampires, and it took years and years to overturn that. Just as an example of some other pages from Ray Bradbury adaptations, particularly that story on the right, There Will Come Soft Rains, that ties into 1950s worries about nuclear war as well. Anyone who's familiar with Ray Bradbury's stories will probably be familiar with that one, the automatic house that goes on dispensing stuff long after the family is dead, and they're just a shadow on the wall, a rather grim little story. But there was also stuff in EC Comics that tied to the civil rights struggle as well, which, due to the censorship, was basically quashed. And the next slide is particularly infamous in comic history, or famous, it's your view as to which, and the whole censorship debate killed it. This is the last panel from a rather well-known story from a comic called Weird Fantasy, Volume 1, Number 18, March-April 1953. Now, throughout the story, the astronaut has a helmet on, and it's not till this last panel you realise he's a black bloke. Except, in some reprints, he isn't a black bloke, because they were forced to recolour it and muck about with it. I'll read out the text, and inside the ship, the man removed his space helmet and shook his head, and the instrument lights made the beads of perspiration on his dark skin twinkle like distant stars. What makes it worse is the whole story was about this black gent, who's an astronaut, going to an alien planet to see if they have got past prejudice and can be admitted to a galactic union of worlds. He concludes no, they haven't, and that they're still feuding and squabbling, and at the end he takes off his helmet. It's obviously a pointed critique of America at the time, and obviously it went down as well as about as well as a Zeppelin made of bricks. It flew about as well as that. It annoyed all the wrong people, was obviously considered to upset people politically, and you could see it playing into the whole red under the bed stuff. Now, EC Comics has never, outside the realms of hardcore comics aficionados, had the same sort of name recognition as DC or Marvel, but there is a reason you might recognise them, and that they play into a much more well-known comic book that many people will recognise. It was adapted a few years ago, and we'll come to that in a second, and I can imagine a lot of people will recognise that one. I think a lot of people will have seen the Zack Snyder adaptation of that particular comic, which I don't hold a lot of regard for. It has a lot of style, but it misses the point, I think, by several orders. The point of the whole thing is lost in the style. But the text piece at the back of Watchmen, when it was published, if you ever go and read the comic, reference a world where, because they had superheroes, they didn't publish superhero comics. They basically didn't work, so they published stuff like EC Comics, pirate and horror comics. And at the back of it, Joe Orlando, who actually worked on comics like that and was in his declining years when Watchmen was published, churned out this sort of lovely, gruesome bit. Now, my own view on censorship is I'm not in favour of it most of the time. There are some extreme things in the comic book world that have been published over the years that I wouldn't love to see on the stands, and there are some particularly nasty things I can think of that I'd be in two minds about. But 99 times out of 100, I think it can be handled by either bagging it on the front as mature, putting it on a top shelf, or using some common sense and discretion. But unfortunately, in the 1950s, this sort of literature was considered so juvenile and so aimed towards children that wasn't going to happen. And it must be said that there is a certain exploitative tone in some of the comics of the era. The infamous Crime Does Not Pay, for example, which shows people's faces being rubbed out Hind Car springs to mind. But the whole period's censorship of this kind of material intersects with McCarthy's sort of attempts to see Reds under the beds, a whole paranoia of nuclear war about to erupt, and the civil rights struggle. And censorship always tends to intersect with political movements like that. It never tends to arise, when it does start arising as a wide-scale movement, as just one thing. It normally tends to intersect with a load of other political realities.